Now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Joanne Smith. Joanne is the president of Price to Profits Consulting, formerly the DuPont corporate head of marketing and pricing, and the author of 2 books. She focuses on helping B2B companies transform their pricing performance. At DuPont, she was instrumental in creating the pricing organization, which transformed DuPont into weak to outstanding pricing performance. So with that, Joanne, welcome.
Thank you, Taylor. Okay, let's just jump right into our topic. I'm actually doing today's webinar around some of the nuggets that I have in my book, The Price Negotiation Playbook. So I'm going to take a couple of thoughts out of the foundation of price negotiations. Some are from Play 2 on the skills for fair price and price increase negotiations, and a little bit from the skills of smart price drop decisions. Today, in our limited time, I won't touch on anything in my Play 4 of the book, which is really geared at, gee, if you can't use price to gain share, how can we both increase price, gain share, and keep our customer loyalty going? So before I really get into it, I want to talk about a misconception that I find in a lot of business leaders as well as commercial leaders. And that is that they so often think that if you're good at sales negotiations, that you're good at price negotiations. And that's just not the truth. If we look at sales negotiations and really putting it down into its simplest type of form, if you will, it's very much about the salesperson along with that customer and really building the relationship, leading to closing the deal. And certainly any good sales negotiation training gets at value, understanding your offerings value as well as understanding the customer needs value. And value certainly is the corner pin of price negotiations as well. But we have to take it a little further. We have to quantify that value and turn it into a quantified fair market price. And we do it in a way that has to really think about our competition and how they're going to react to whatever price we put forward, not only in this deal, but how they're going to react and what that deal is going to cause them to do in every future deal. When we put it all together in pricing, we often have to be careful about those decisions, not only as they affect competition, but it also affects future customer behaviors. So we have to be very careful not to take behaviors that ultimately lead to a downward spiral in price over time. And in fact, when we get really good at it, we can go into an upward spiral and actually help the whole market price go higher. And then the last thing we need to be thinking about quite often is around volume price trade-offs, which we so often have to make, and which I see done incorrectly and profit-destroying decisions all the time. So when we think about those differences, and when I was writing this book, I did a little research on sales negotiation, the top 100 books on Amazon, as well as the top 100 sales process books on Amazon. And I was looking to see how many chapters were devoted to the price negotiation side. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, depending how I look at it, there in all of those books, there were only 3 chapters dedicated to price negotiations, and the longest one was 5 pages. So clearly, this is not something that's entering strongly enough into our training. Now, I said I was surprised and yet not surprised, because as I ran DuPont's corporate marketing and customer loyalty, I took many sales negotiation courses looking for what were good ones for DuPont, including one called Price Pressure Negotiations. And they were all great courses, but they didn't get into the price negotiation side, and we have to have both sides of that equation. The other thing I'll say is I trained predominantly when I train sales forces, more times than not, it's a fairly senior group of sales folks, right? And they may come in a bit skeptical, but very quickly they're realizing and learning very practical skills that they can make smarter decisions the next day. So with that as background, what I want to do is throughout this talk, in addition to what the title suggests, is that we'll talk about the key to price negotiation success. I'd like you to walk away with a little self-assessment of your own organization's pricing skills. Yes, price negotiation skills. So you have a sense on whether this is an area that you want to get further into and what kind of profits it might lead you if you do. So as I go through this, I invite you on a piece of paper to do your own little scoring, and kind of at the end, we'll look at and give you a chance to vote online so we can see how, in general, folks are reacting to this. But I'm going to go through some of these elements, and I'm going to weave in some teaching between certain elements, particularly those that I feel are maybe less obvious. But let me just start first with the price variance and price increase success. These are things you could literally measure, but let's start with price variance. What we're talking about here is if you were to take one of your larger products and think about the different prices your customer base has, do you have a lot of variance from the little guy to the big guy, and even for customers of similar size? So it is not unusual at all to see the little guys have a 30–40% price difference. And there's always a good reason in the eyes of sales, but there's a pretty big difference. Even the big guys, I often see some pretty wide variance. So if you have a lot of wide variance, I'd give yourself that kind of 1 or 2 down there, which is on the weaker side. And if you're more like maybe a 10% sort of variance, because in B2B, we do have to vary at times, and for some really good reason, volume being kind of one of those. So if you're more in that 10% scatter, you might be a 5, and that would be very unusual and very strong. Now let's talk about price increase success. So if you don't do something like an annual price increase, give yourself a 1 just to start out. But if you're doing these increases, think about your success rate. And I'd like you to think about this in terms of your top, say 10 to 20% of your largest customers. And think about, do 100% of them take the increase? And do they take 100% of the targeted rate we were after? So that would be 100%. If that occurred, that would be a 5. I will tell you that the majority of companies from surveys out there would be 50% and below. So give yourself a 3 if you're about 50%. And my personal experience with most of my clients before we start working is 30% success rate is about the best that they do. So rate yourself there. Let's talk a little bit about profit culture now. And I want to talk about this and build this up a little. We're going to start to weave in the training. So when you think about your culture, I want you to think about both the formal and the informal. So formal would be how you incent your sales force, as an example. Informal might be just the things your leader says and the way the leaders behave. So think about this from, if I was asking the sales force, how would they perceive the culture, and would they perceive it to the right, which is, to the left, would say very volume oriented, that they think their leaders really want them to predominantly go for volume, share growth. The next account dominates their thinking, right? Volume is king. That would be down there in that 1 and 2 range. In around 3 might be revenue based, where the leadership might be encouraging both price and volume as long as revenue continues to increase. And then if we get towards that 4 or 5, We're talking about an organization that is very profit focused, and they want you to actually balance the best price and the best volume that comes out with the highest profit. And I will say on this side, and I've got a little quote there, T.S. Eliot, only those who will risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go. And by this, I mean, if you're profit focused, to get to that 4 or 5, you also have to have a leadership that is willing to allow you to risk some volume as you go for your fair price, right? And if that organization is just unwilling to risk volume and need to play your price conservatively, your culture is not in the 4 or 5. All right, so that's setting the stage. Now let's jump into this price volume trade-off decisions, which I already mentioned is an area that is often done incorrectly and destroys profits as a result. So if you think about what your sales folks are likely thinking when they think about price volume trade-offs, if you suspect that they think about it as, gee, if they drop price 10%, then all they need to do is increase volume more than 10% to have made a better, smarter decision, right? Almost a one-to-one relationship in the opposite direction. If that's you, give yourself a 1, because that is a profit-destroying type of decision. So if we really think about the typical Fortune 1000 company, price is about 4 times as powerful in delivering profits as volume, right? So if you drop 10%, you would need to get more than 40% gain in your volume just to offset that price drop, just to be sure you didn't destroy profits. So if you kind of have that thinking, you know, that brings you closer to a 3. But what gets you up there at that really strong place is understanding how to apply it to your business, your product, and perhaps right down at a customer level. Because unfortunately, price volume trade-offs are very much tied to the contribution profitability of every product or customer deal. And so there's very, very simple ways that I talk about in the book to make this very practical. But this is one of the things that your sales organization should be able to use, as well as your leadership, as you decide price up or price down. So as an example, if we were dropping price 10% and we were thinking of a typical commodity that has low contribution margin, you would literally need to gain 100% more volume. What are the odds competition is going to let you double your volume without also dropping price to go after and maintain their share? Pretty weak, but that is one of the things. If you get a very special product line, it might be only 25% that you have to gain if you drop at 10%. Still, pricing is far more dominant and a bigger impact on pricing, even for our specialty products. And then if we think about, gee, let's raise price. If I'm a commodity, I could afford to lose as much as 1/3 of my business and still be more profitable if I got my price up 10%. So if you think your sales organization understands this very well and applies it, then give yourself that 4 or 5. Now let's turn to value and use pricing and segmentation. And I'm going to kind of talk about these two together. Segmentation is really just an advanced form of your value and use pricing. So I got to back up here and just talk a little bit about the market price first. When you bring out a new product, it's quite unique. It usually, therefore, has a pretty high price. But as soon as competition starts to come in with products that compete against it, the price generally starts to get more competitive. It starts to drop. And if we look at the life cycle of a product, over time, that price usually drops. Now, it might go up or down in the interim based on maybe there's a recession, maybe there's a temporary tightness of supply demand, or an increase in raw material prices that may swing it. But over time, it drops. And if we think about the value price, that's our ability to literally quantify how much value we have above and beyond our competition, which we'll refer to as kind of the market price, and use that to set a fair value price. Now, by the way, I'm showing that orange line above, assuming that your products and your offering is actually of higher value. For some of you, you might actually have the orange line below market price because you have a weaker offering. And you'll still need to want to understand how much weaker so you don't discount far more than you need to, that you'll still understand that value equation. So when it comes to value pricing, we don't just value price, we have to drive it all through value marketing and ultimately to the value selling and negotiations. And I'm just going to talk to this one chart in this area of value pricing, although I go quite in depth in my book into it. By the way, I will say that Leverage Point, who's hosting this for us today, has a system that actually enables many pieces of this value pricing, value selling. So at the left end, we have to understand the needs of our customers, quantify that value, and set the right price point. In the middle, we have to have, and that's price setting. So that's not, sales is involved, but it's not quite yet in the negotiation stage. We get into value selling and value marketing. We have to tailor it to segments. We have to be able to communicate our value. And if we're really good, we can influence the perception of value in the way we communicate, both from a marketing and a communication or a sales side. Ultimately, then we value negotiate. We tailor it down to the specific customer. We know our pricing power at that customer. And if we need a discount, we do it in a very value-based way. So if you think you're really good at this, give yourself a 5. Now, I said we would drive this through segmentation. So I find a lot of businesses are a little bit better at understanding their value in use at a market level or market application level, at maybe a region or country level. Perhaps a little less so, but some at the channel. Is it a face-to-face sales or is it an online channel? But one of the keys as we actually get down to price negotiations is to understand our customer needs-based segmentation, which is often a subset of any of the other 3. So I could go into any market in any region of the world and a channel, and I am likely to find at least 3 of the 4 type of buyers that I'm listed below here. So you're likely to have a very price-sensitive group, those that are unwilling to pay for any extras. You're likely to have a value buyer group, maybe 1 or 2, that value just a portion, maybe 1 or 2 features, but not everything. They're still quite price sensitive. Then you have your relationship group that's very loyal. They like to partner with you. And you may or may not have a convenience buyer that just likes the ease of doing business and the speed of doing business with you. So many sales groups don't understand this at all, or they think they understand it, but they get confused and a little bit off when they try and actually identify their customers and the type of buyer that they are. And they do this or get confused in part because many buyers, particularly that value buyer who's probably your largest group, portrays themselves as a price buyer. They do everything they can to disguise themselves and convince you that they're a price buyer so they can get you to drop your price. And they usually are quite effective at that. And then when we get to the price buyer and we think, geez, that we've got no pricing power here, that's really not quite the case either, because if you happen to have an important product to that group, if it's risky for them, then you actually have more pricing power than you think if you tend to be good in the things like consistent quality, high reliability, short lead time. So how well your salespeople can accurately identify these is part of segmentation. So think about that, give yourself a rating. And by the way, a little bit later, we're going to talk about how well you do in terms of knowing your pricing power and using it. Because ultimately, you don't just understand the type of buyer. We have to have different policies and tactics that we use for each type of buyer. So we're going to come to that in a moment. So now we're down to that last three, and I'm going to talk together about the market price impact and knowing and adjusting to your pricing power and how well you do that. So earlier I talked about market price declining over time. Well, here's where I will tell you, if you are not actively managing your behaviors as sales individuals and as a sales team, you are almost assuredly, unintentionally taking behaviors that are driving the market price lower and faster down than it need be. And in fact, when you get good at not just taking away those kind of bad behaviors, but actually adding in proactive best behaviors, you can actually move that market price up, higher, longer. And so I think about this as kind of pushing a boulder uphill. You push it uphill, you have that downward force of gravity trying to push it down. With price, we have the customer pressure pushing down. We have probably a couple of low price aggressive competitors pushing the price down. And if we ignore it, if we don't push up on those prices, that's where we start to see the market price drop. So we need to at least put enough pressure to stop the decline, and then when we're good, we're actually going to move it upwards. So I'm talking about this as market price. Some people refer to this as industry level pricing or strategic level pricing, but it is a critical area for our sales negotiations or our sales teams to know for price negotiations. So if you happen to be a group that tends to hear your sales folks saying, hey, we tried to increase price that way, or we tried to get that new price on that new product in this way, but it is just too competitive out there. We can't get that price. It was too high. You probably all have heard that at different points, perhaps often. And then you're struggling with, was the price really too high, or was it weak execution? And I will tell you from my experience, 90% of the time, it wasn't that your price was really too high. It was your execution skills. And let me just say, when I think about execution skills, it's probably 80-20 sales folks, but there are pieces of this that are your pricing team, your marketing team, and your business team that all add into execution, right? So they absolutely influence us there. And let me just speak to 4 business cases that kind of illustrate why I say it's more about execution than higher price. And by the way, I could have taken hundreds of different examples. I chose these 4 because they're all about billion-dollar, rough plus or minus businesses, so you can easily kind of translate that math to your own business. And they are a wide variety of equipment to chemicals, food industry, housing industry, very special products, undifferentiated products, and all the way to true commodity products that go through traders. So quite a range. And in all 4 cases, as I was brought in to work with these teams, they all described their markets as having very price aggressive customers, very price aggressive competitors, and 3 of the 4 historically had had very low price increase success, right? They just thought their business was way too competitive, and if they tried to increase price, competitors would come in and take their share. The 4th business actually had just finished a reasonable price increase. Not what I'd call great, but decent. But they had just also come off of a very tight market, and a brand new large asset was coming online. So it was just a matter of months before the market was going to no longer be loose. So in all of these cases, highly competitive, very low pricing power is the way they all describe their business. I spent 1 to 2 weeks max with these businesses, and within weeks they had implemented with results of 100 million, 25 million, 32 million. The other business wouldn't actually give me their number, but for the first time in more than a dozen price increases, they actually had good success. So what changed? How was it that they all thought their competitive environment would not withstand increasing price, and yet consistently big numbers coming forward? So what was the key? And that's what we're talking about today. And gosh, I would need a full day with you to really get into all of the elements. So we're just going to talk about kind of the top key. And I'm going to build up. So I'm not giving you the answer just yet, but let me ground us in saying price execution success has 4 market forces that influence it. Clearly, your competitors' behaviors, your customers' behaviors, the market dynamics, is it a recessionary time? Is it tight supply demand? And your own behaviors. And all of these affect all the others, right? None of them are working independently. So what was the difference in those 4 or hundreds of other price increases I could talk about? It was the behavior of the company itself, of the sales force themselves. They changed their own behaviors and suddenly did things they didn't think were possible. So many of you may be familiar with Steve Covey. He's been around 25, almost 30 years, and world renowned in change improvement, right? So he wrote amongst many books, but the one that really gained his first attention was The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And a quote here from Stephen, which is really the principle of what he drives change from, is, if I really want to improve, I can work on the one thing over which I have control, myself. And I will tell you, in pricing, that holds so truly. When you change your behaviors, right, you stop doing some kind of the negative things I'll talk about in a moment, and you begin to adopt best practices, it is amazing the kinds of effect that you can have that suddenly influence and cause your customers to behave differently, cause your competitors to likely behave differently, and in fact cause you where you can't change the market dynamic, but suddenly you can change how it is that when it's favorable, you get much faster at about acting on it and getting higher price, and when it's unfavorable, you can influence it in such a way that the price falls slower or less deeply. So again, we might need a day or 2 days to really go through all the kind of best practices, but let me just pick one. And that is, one key is that sales must have genuine confidence and conviction and courage when they go into a negotiation, right? It has to be genuine. And for me, that comes predominantly from 3 simple areas. The first is They believe that whoever set that price set a fair price or a fair price increase. And they know the rationale behind that, so they, with confidence, can speak to why it is a fair price or price increase. All right, so we have to communicate that pricing fairly to our own sales force so they can effectively sell. At the far right, I talk about leadership. This goes back to your culture. They have to believe their leadership will allow them to risk volume as they go for the proper and best fair price for their products. And then, of course, they need the price negotiation skills that we're touching on here today. And so I'm going to talk about the skills, and I'm going to come at it from what are some of the skills that we often do that aren't so good, that cause a decline. And I'm going to do this from the fact that I'm going to tell you that buyers are like dogs. So if there's any purchasing people on the line, you ought to know I love dogs. So don't take this personally. But buyers are like dogs. They're like all nice and happy to see you. And as soon as they see you, what do? They kind of sniff you right out. They're trying to get a sense. And boy, if they smell uncertainty or fear, many dogs get pretty aggressive, right? And the same thing with buyers. I will tell you in a heartbeat, buyers can sense when that salesperson comes in and they're not confident, they're embarrassed, they're apologizing, they're like, it wasn't me, my management made me do it, whatever. They can very quickly sense that there is not genuine confidence in what their price is and that it's a fair price. And then, boy, they're going to get aggressive. They're going to use every tactic because they know they got you. They're going to be able to talk you into a discount. And what happens when we give them that discount? Well, it's just like training a dog, right? It's like giving a dog a biscuit so that they want to repeat the behavior. For the buyer, he gets a lower price, and he's just going to then use those tactics more and more. So now we've got more aggressive customers. But that's not the only thing that happens. Those customers will almost assuredly tell the other suppliers that they've been getting discounts from you, that you're not increasing price, that you are lower price, and that those other suppliers are higher price. They will twist every bit of that knowledge to make the competitor believe that they're higher priced and you are dropping price. So now your competitors have lost some of their confidence in their price. Suddenly they're afraid to increase price and they start to back off and discount more. And this is where we get that downward, that snowball that ultimately leads to lower price and may even get into price wars. So as we think about that, obviously, and we don't have time today, we want the behaviors that stop this and we replace them with the kind of proactive behaviors. Part of which means we need to understand our pricing power. And that pricing power is going to vary, not only at the market segment level, but surely at the customer needs level. And there are a number of things that a salesperson has to evaluate in a given deal. I'm showing just a couple. There's a couple more. And by the way, it may seem complex, but there's very practical ways that I cover in my book so that they can do this and do this quite well. But they've got to be judging the risk and the reward. Who might they gain or lose the volume to? Is it a credible competitor? Is it a new competitor? What's their value opposite the competitor? What's the price volume trade-off? What kind of competitive dynamic might this cause? What kind of reaction, not only in this deal, but in future deals? And surely we go back to that customer needs and we have to understand which of these kind of buyers are out there, because clearly we have more pricing power with a relationship buyer, as an example, than a value, and a value more than a price buyer. So how well does your sales force really understand their pricing power in any given deal? And then ultimately, then they have to apply different behaviors. Because once we know our power, we know the different types of buyer, we have to take different policies and different tactics and different ways when we think about, do we discount or do we not? Do we walk away? Do we drop some, but we still give ourselves a value premium? Can we do a give and take? If we drop price, do we get something for it or take something away? And should we give multiple choices or trade-off choices? You know, kind of the gold, bronze, silver idea for certain customer groups. Should we change our contract terms temporarily or for an annual kind of basis? So there's a number of things that they then have to apply it. Again, can be complex, but there's very simple ways as we go through in my book or in my training that allow a sales force to do this rather quickly and effectively. So coming back to our assessment, if you haven't already measured yourself on your market price, how well do you influence market price upwards versus behaviors that might drive it down? How well did you score yourself on knowing your pricing power and then knowing how to apply it and adjust your policies and tactics for that power? Then the last thing is managing aggressive competitors. Unfortunately, most of us will have some competitor out there through time that targets our loyal customers, that really goes after our key markets with low price. So how well do you manage? If you ignore them and hope that it'll stop, give yourself that one or two. If you go after them to try and stop that behavior, but you keep going after in such a way that you actually drive price down for both of you, then that's a weak score. But if your team, and by the way, often we involve our sales leadership when we get to this point of a really aggressive competitor, so we do it kind of as a group decision. If you know how to take behaviors that mitigate that competitor from doing it, but do it in a way that doesn't start, if you will, a little mini price war, then you can give yourself a 4 or 5. So by now you should have rated yourself on every category. And in a minute, we're going to ask you to kind of, or give you an opportunity to share your overall result. So we can all see how we're doing. Taylor, can I turn it over to you here?
You sure can. So I am going to launch that poll right now. So take your last moment to rank all of these categories for you and your organization. And I'm going to launch this right now. So please enter your answer onto the screen. All right, we've got about 50% of audience votes. So just enter that answer onto your screen, and I will close the poll in about 30 seconds. All right, we've got about 70% of the audience that has voted. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll and display the results. Okay, so seems pretty standard to me. We've got 43% of the audience indicating that they are mostly 3 or less, 48% of the audience indicating they are several items 3 or less, and 9% indicating mostly all 4s and 5s. So Joanne, what do you think?
All right, very, very interesting. So let me first say that generally when you self-assess, about 60% of folks will self-assess themselves one category better than they are. And they don't do this intentionally. They do it because they think they understand what the best bar is and that they're fairly close, but they don't know what they don't know. They don't realize that the bar and the best level is significantly higher, and therefore they're maybe further from being a 5, if you will, than we think. So, but clearly we have, in this case, over 90% being in the threes, fours, and down. So if I look at that, the good news is the large majority of you have very large improvement opportunity that for a typical business might be a 3 to 10% revenue uplift as profit. So as profit, which means that's 3 or 4 times bigger than that on a profit gain. Several of you, or about half of you, and again, I suspect half that thinks they're in the middle still has a moderate to large. I suspect at least half of you are really not quite as strong as you might think. You still have a 1 to 3% revenue uplift type if you're typical. So again, big dollars. And then the few of you that are there in the 4s or 5s, fantastic. You may have pretty minimal. You're in really great shape. So, and by the way, you know who you are. I'd love you to send me a little note offline, because you would be the first businesses that I have seen that have been able to be predominantly 4 or 5, and I'd love to talk to you. All right, so let's take this a little further. If you're in the 90% of folks that might want to improve, then let me just tell you, here's some ways that you can think about. Certainly my book covers a lot of this best practice in depth. And what it has after each major play are worksheets. So some groups buy this and the whole sales team goes through it, and then they sit together and they do the worksheets after each play so they can begin to see their gap areas and begin to focus on where and how to improve. So that's certainly one way. The Professional Pricing Society within the next couple weeks is actually offering a online course series targeted at the sales organizations. And they're 3-hour courses each. Now, they've always had them for pricing folks, but they're adding new that are very specific to the pricing group. 3 of those are ones that I'm facilitating. There's value pricing, one set for sales organization, the other for marketing and product line management. And then price negotiations, which is, and winning your best price, which is much more about that industry level price and market price. And then, of course, you can always do a 1-day course with your sales first right on site, or a multiple day training where you do it, you apply it, you get to strategy. That multiple several days is more what I did in those 4 business cases that I talked to that had the double-digit growth. But if you're just looking at the online courses, the book, the 1-day training, you're going to see your sales folks making better and decisions the next day. So with that, I guess I'm going to turn that back over, Taylor, to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Joanne, for sharing those insights. And we have had a few questions come in during the webinar, and there's still time to enter your question into the panel on your screen. While you're entering, a reminder to complete the 10-second survey while exiting today's webinar to be entered into a raffle for 1 free copy of Joanne's book, The Price Negotiation Playbook. Now, to give you a few more minutes to enter your questions, a few words on leverage points. Joanne did an excellent job answering this question, and many research firms and vendors agree. Sales Benchmark Index states that over 60% of forecasted deals do nothing. Why? Well, Forrester Research makes sense of that statistic with these next 2 quotes. They say, the first vendor to succeed in communicating a vision of value to executives wins the business 74% of the time. And only 22% of executive buyers feel that salespeople understand their issues and where they can help, showing that customer value communication and selling are closely tied with closing deals. So now we understand why we should be using value, but where does Leverage Point come in? Well, Leverage Point offers a SaaS solution that aligns product, pricing, marketing, sales enablement, and sales teams around creating, capturing, and communicating value. In the creation side of Leverage Point, products, marketing, and pricing team members build value equations, models, and messages. They publish that value proposition, including the corporate branding and messaging, into a cloud-based library. The value proposition is accessible using custom filters by every single rep in your organization, so they can leverage it and customize it for every customer call. One approved value proposition can turn into infinite unique value propositions. Value strategies support effective and efficient decision-making through product development. In the early stages, product direction can be supported with customer-centric R&D decisions to reduce cost and development time. Value strategies improve pricing and offer design to increase margins, and organizations utilizing value can rapidly ramp product revenues and achieve revenue objectives. After product development, the eyes are on the sales team to effectively communicate the published value propositions to customers and prospects. The best way to drive deals and quickly qualify prospects is to digitally transform a generic case study into a specific buyer business case through effective customer conversations. Sales reps can start quickly by embedding baseline data from a case study into Leverage Point and change numbers in real time during the customer call in order to create a unique business case to buy that the prospect can then take and leverage internally to drive the deal forward. For account executives and sales reps, value propositions are useful early in the sales cycle as flexible case studies in call preparation, building sales confidence, qualifying opportunities, and engaging customer executives. For technical sales and pre-sales professionals, joining the team in the middle of the sales process, value propositions provide customer value analyses as an important consultative selling tool to address pre-sales challenges. As customers decide to purchase, the value proposition becomes a shared business case, collaboratively agreed between sales executives and customer sponsors that serves as the buyer's internal financial justification to purchase and a sales team's asset in a price negotiation. Value propositions in Leverage Point can be linked directly to an opportunity in Salesforce, downloaded to PDF or PowerPoint at any time for a personalized leave behind. On average, our clients achieve 5 to 15% higher closure rates at 5 to 25% higher prices when using Leverage Point value propositions. So if you found any of that interesting, we'd love to have you enter into a raffle we're doing every single month where we digitally transform one of your case studies free of charge. Just check the corresponding box in the exit survey upon leaving today's webinar or email us at casestudies@leveragepoint.com. All right, that's it from me. I see we've had some great questions so far. First and foremost, yes, this webinar is recorded and the slides and recording will be emailed to you within 2 business days. And now for Q&A, I'd like to introduce Leverage Point CEO, Peyton Marshall.
Thanks, Taylor, and congratulations on your new book, Joanne. For those who haven't picked up a copy of the Price Negotiation Playbook, go straight to Amazon. I've had a chance to read it. It reads so clearly, it's almost beach reading. So think about getting it because it's a great reference. In the book, Joanne takes a really practical approach to negotiation skills. She writes in a style that makes you pause and think. And in the way she set it out and organized it is really useful because starting with foundations, there's a fork in the road where then she gets into playing offense on fair price and price increases or playing defense with smart price drop decisions, before she brings it all back to long-term success. So check it out, highly recommended. Taylor?
Great, thanks so much. Okay, let's get started on Q&A. So for the first question, would you suggest businesses first work on value in use pricing skills, industry level pricing, or price negotiation skills?
I thought it was a great question. And I emphatically want to say that if you want your best pricing, your best profits, you absolutely have to work on both sides of that. The industry level, the negotiation skill, and the value in use. But if you were to force me to say which first, right, because we can't always do everything at once, then I would say it depends on your product line, the complexity of your product line, and how more commoditized or special your product line. So as an example, if you have a special product line, any given product potentially has its bigger uplift when we think about value and use and how far we can push that price. But if you happen to have 3,000 special products, you're doing value and use one product and the next product and the next. So you might get bigger uplift, but over a smaller volume. And so it may take you just a longer time to get to big dollars. When we think about market-based pricing, price negotiations, that's affecting every single deal. You can get on with that very quickly. And so you're going to see an uplift right away. It may not be quite as large an uplift, but it's over a bigger volume. So saying that, if you're more commoditized, I would start with the price negotiations, with the market-based training. If you are more special, particularly if you have a couple of large products so that you can get really big dollars fast, then I might start that way.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, next question. If you have a very experienced sales force, one that has taken sales negotiation courses, would you suggest price negotiation training?
Yes, and this is so, I think I mentioned this early on. Most of the companies that I work with just happen to have very experienced sales force. And I will tell you, they come in, say, for an all-day training with me, and most of them come in and you see the body language right away. The arms are crossed, they're kind of scowling, they're thinking, oh, what could you possibly tell me, that you need 8 hours to tell me? I've been in this 20, 30 years. And yet very quickly that body language turns around, and it is not uncommon for me to hear comments like, this is the best training of my career, which is certainly exciting to hear, but it just tells us how even our strongest closers have some room to grow as they learn about the price side of things.
Absolutely. All right, we've got a lot of questions, so I'm just going to give you the next one. You talk about segmentation and describe buyer types. You might think of that as behavioral segmentation. In building out a price negotiation playbook, how else do you look at relevant segmentation? Does understanding customer value help?
So segmentation is all about understanding value. So that second part of your question, no matter what segment, we must understand value and turn it into quantification. So the types of segmentation, I certainly talked about customer needs based in that final staging of pricing power and knowing your, how to negotiate. But ahead of that, you have to understand market application, because if you're selling to electronics, to automotive, to cosmetics, that same product may have very different value there, and you need to understand that. You may be in different regions of the world that have different regulations that affect that. So absolutely, channel, market, region, have to be in it, have to understand the value before we then tailor it down at the customer needs-based level. Peyton, would you have any comment or add on to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Joanne. If you're value selling before you're negotiating, you're really identifying a lot of potential data and information that help you segment as you go. And that includes everything from customer scale to customer market conditions to different buyers have different problems. And sometimes a value driver resonates and sometimes it doesn't. And different customers are making different decisions versus the status quo or versus a direct competitor. So you learn a lot in value selling that can help you in the price negotiation.
Peyton, hey, excellent point. And if I wasn't clear before, we never get into jumping right to price negotiations before we've had that value discussion.
Great. All right, next question. How does pricing for services impact the illustrated strategy?
So services are just another form of value. You've got your physical products, and then you have the varying services. You have your brand reputation, your reliability, the customer experience. All of those are part of your value and need to be considered appropriately in the same way we would do any of this. So clearly, if you've got commoditized products and you're a little bit better on your services, it's not unusual to see a true commodity have a 20% premium with certain market segments just based on that service or that reliability, that reputation. So clearly, we want to have that into our thinking, and we're following the same methodology.
Great. So I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions. Should value follow the cost of manufacturing?
Should it follow the cost? Well, value is in the eyes of the beholder. It's in the eyes of the customer. And so that is usually not aligned per se with your cost of manufacture, and let's all hope it's higher than our cost of manufacture. So best practice, the companies that get the highest profits actually do pricing not based on a cost plus, right? That would not be your strongest lever. Having said that, even good value pricers, if they have a major cost increase, can still, when we think about market-based price, begin to use that and enter that into how they influence total market price, right? So if the total market price goes up as they think about it, and all their competition has to be going up as well, they then get yet even a higher value premium. So we don't ignore cost, but value and use pricing is the superior way than a strictly cost plus.
Great. And last one for you. And if we didn't get to your question, we will make sure to follow up. I'll send all of these over to Joanne. But last one for you. So how do you price a product or a specialty product when you don't have the market information available, when you don't have all the data?
Right. Yeah. And we often don't have all of the data. But if you pull together a cross-functional team and you do some hypotheses on what that value might be and what the quantification might be, and by the way, you might have to use a range. If the less information you know, you might have to say, well, gee, we think it's going to improve yield 10 to 20% because we don't know the exact number. But as you do that collectively and you follow a best practice, I usually take a group over a full day workshop, and we can very quickly figure out what are the most important gaps. We can get the range around it that often allows us to get started on that pricing. And then we often have to say, here's the critical things we're going to do some action to learn a little bit more, to refine it in the market, which you can do in a couple of week period quite often. So we might use those type of techniques. There's certainly other techniques of looking at different yet similar products and how they've handled the same value, or using case studies as examples. So this is a very complex area, but the fact that you don't know the answer should not stop you from moving forward, because there really are some practical ways that you can get through that relatively quickly. Peyton, maybe you have a jump in on that one.
No, well, I think you've said it. I think you said it really well. You always start with gaps in your information and being ready to come up with hypotheses that you can confirm in customer conversations. It's how you build that available information. Got to start somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Well, that is all the time we have for today. Just right before you go, a reminder to register for next month's webinar during the exit survey. Chris Provines is back discussing engaging the professional buyer, utilizing value to close deals and build relationships. But that is it from us for today. So thank you all for taking the time to join us, and a special thank you to Joanne for your insights and for Peyton for joining us for Q&A. From all of us here at Leverage Point, have a wonderful rest of your week. Take care.